We are not very far into Mark's gospel today. We start in chapter 2 and in the beginning of chapter 3. And yet, not very far into Mark's gospel, this is the fourth time Jesus is pushing someone's buttons about the Sabbath. He's healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law on the Sabbath. We might have heard about that before Lent. And then he started to heal the whole town, as it were. They were bringing people to him. And now we have a generic Sabbath with Jesus and the disciples going through the grain fields and the disciples plucking off heads of grain and eating them. As we read this, we probably read into it that they were very hungry. That's a reasonable thing to read into the text. But it's not in the text itself. And usually when Jesus is breaking a rule or changing something, the evangelists are explicit about what's going on. Eating is not necessarily working for the sake of the Sabbath. And in the first century of the Common Era, the oral tradition concerning and governing Sabbath work was that harvesting by hand would have been okay. Using a sickle would not, though. But we don't even have that grounding that they were hungry. Just that they are. And so the Pharisees complain about Jesus. Complain about his disciples. Complain about work on the Sabbath. Something else. So then they go into the synagogue. It is the Sabbath. Jesus is a very observant Jew. It's important to remember that, particularly when we hear stories where Jesus is in conflict with other Jewish leaders. There's a man with a withered hand. And Jesus says, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill?" Jesus has already grounded whatever is about to happen in the maxim, the Sabbath was made for humanity and not humanity for the Sabbath. It was generally understood that in life or death situations, what might be considered work was a-okay to do to save someone's life. That absolutely mattered more. But this man with the withered hand is probably going to make it through the night. This could wait, as it were. But the Pharisees are silent. So Jesus says to him, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out and his hand was restored. Mark says that the Pharisees went out then and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. As Jesus, barely into chapter 3, is for a fourth time pushing buttons about the Sabbath, what he's doing is breaking down barriers to salvation. And I don't mean salvation in the terms that we know it, particularly in American Protestantism, of the need to get saved. But the salvation that is the restoration to the fullness of life, healing in mind, body, and spirit. What Jesus does when he performs these healing miracles is brings people together, makes them whole, but not just in their bodies. Something we lose when we hear healing stories and exorcism stories in the Gospels is how lonely it was to not be whatever the norm was. with a withered hand, with a bleed lasting 20 years, with leprosy, the evangelist's catch-all for so many things, rendered one ritually impure, which limited their access to the community worshiping God, but not God's self. But not just the community worshiping God, but the community as a whole. And as Jesus performs these healing works on the Sabbath or otherwise, he brings people back into the fullness of life that he has come to make available to all people. Surely there is nothing work about this man with the withered hand stretching it out. Mark says that in the stretching it is restored. This isn't even a miracle where Jesus touches or spits or makes a poultice. Merely says, reach out your arm and it is healed. I think we do a pretty good job here of keeping boundaries low for who can come to know the fullness of life in God through Christ in this place. That's what Jesus' full mission is breaking down the barriers between human and divine, pulling us all into God's work of reconciliation and restoration. And I think it's worth noting, though, that barely into the 3rd chapter, the Sabbath keeps coming up. The need for rest. It comes up in these instances with Jesus breaking rules about it. But the rules largely are there to make sure you get the rest. At Bible study on Thursday, we talked about how it used to feel maybe liberating to be able to get something done on Sunday that you wouldn't have been able to do before. Like, great, I can go to a movie now. I can get this prescription filled. But because there is no societal shut-off day, what was once perhaps liberative feeling is now just part of the crush of the grind. People who are at Bible study know this. Some of you know this. My first job was slinging chicken, as my mom said, at Chick-fil-A. I worked in the front, largely in the drive-thru. It was a great job for me. I had great employers. And while there's a lot going on with Chick-fil-A, we'll just leave it at that, including their being closed on Sunday, which was really annoying when you land in Atlanta and you really just want a chicken biscuit and it's Sunday. But part of the mantra, part of the ethos corporately, is not taking over the government and demanding that things be closed on Sundays. It is corporately saying everyone deserves at least one true full day off. And in my store, we also got another day off, which was great. So while Jesus is breaking down barriers, Mark and Jesus both are pointing us toward the reality of the freedom that comes in God, full stop, and the freedom that is known through rest. A few weeks ago I quoted, and don't remember who it was, because it was a random person from Twitter. I had the citation then. But he said that when work is an idol, rest feels like sin. When work is an idol, rest feels like sin. In the country built on the Protestant work ethic, how very dare he? I don't have a grand point today. I had a very busy week. Brandon is in Houston for a medical conference. He left yesterday. The Bishop's Committee had a spectacular retreat yesterday morning. I'm taking tomorrow as a sick day. As we come to the end of the program year, Christian education for adults has ended already. It's ending for children soon. The choir will be departing from this spot, hopefully to out over here, not actually just leaving. I want us to think about how we rest, individually and together. How it's good for us, how God models it after 6 days of creation, and then commands God's covenant people to take a day of rest. How these Pharisees are joining with the Herodians. One commentary says that Mark made that word up to talk about a group of people joining with the Pharisees to plot against Jesus. But their concerns are pure to some extent, to keep the Sabbath full of rest. I'm not going to say that's a set day of the week, but to wonder what our recreation is and our downtime is, and whether it is life-giving or life-sucking. At the end of Bible study, I often ask, what would you preach on? What's the good news? And this week it was turned back to me, as it often is, and I said that I was preaching on why I was not taking a single day less than the 4 months my letter of agreement gives me for my sabbatical. I'm not preaching on that, as it were. But I am taking my sabbatical the whole time, starting July 1st, so that I can rest and so that you can have a break from me and my loud children. This is just a story from Mark's Gospel where Mark is making a few points. They'll be developed through the Gospel. But already Mark is saying, this Jesus, who is Lord of the Sabbath, comes to bring a fullness of life. And that fullness of life can't be stopped by the things we put in the way. And that fullness of life is helped when we rest. Look to Jesus. Stretch out your arms to be healed. Find rest in your Creator. Amen.